2. Second son. Before Daddy could explain what had happened, the other sleepers started to stir. First there was the man in the bottom berth. He stretched his cramped legs through the open side of his box, and then followed with a pair of arms, a head and then the rest of his torso, rather like a lizard emerging from an egg. He sat for a moment on the floor, his hands on the ground for support. The man's hair was thick and curly, his body compact and muscular. His skin was rough and red, as if he'd spent the past few days gardening or playing on the beach under a bright sun. Sprawled out on the floor, he looked like a soccer player who had collided with a goalpost, a dazed athlete, not yet ready to leap up and resume the game. Warily his eyes moved up the tall figure of Daddy, who was helping his mother stay on her feet. Despite his bent head and careless slouch, at several inches above 6 feet, Daddy towered over her. When the younger man's gaze finally came to rest on Daddy's face, he seemed even more alarmed than Daddy's mother had been. "Where did you come from?" he cried out. "I've been here the whole time," Daddy began. "I just woke up a little earlier than the rest of you. That's all." "You don't recognize him, Sam?" Daddy's mother asked, reaching out an arm to help the man stand up. "He does look faintly familiar. A little like your father, Betsy." "Oh, now wait a minute here. Your father didn't manage to stow away on board with us, did he?" Betsy Ramsey began to cry. "Father's dead by now," she said. "Mother, too. We knew they would be, Betsy," the man said gently. "Long before we started out, we knew there would be no turning back. They're all dead by now, most everyone we knew. It's been a long time, Lady Liz. There's a whole new generation back on Earth." A whole new generation, Daddy thought. Generations, if his calculations were right. But what about Tony and Alan? His two best friends in the world, in the universe. By now they should be sleepers, too, on their own journey through space. But there was no time to think about Tony and Alan, not just now. "You still haven't told me who the old man is," the man said, jabbing a thumb in Daddy's direction. Before anyone could answer, the boy in the topmost of the berths jumped to the ground. He must have been about 13, and like the others, he wore the grey space agency coveralls with the red insignia. He looked at his watch and gave a little yelp. "Asleep for 107 years. He yawned. "I wonder why I still feel so sleepy. And, boy, am I ready for a whopping breakfast. Where are the eats?" Then he noticed Daddy. "Who's the old guy, Mom?" Daddy tried to speak, but broke into sobs again. Suddenly they all heard a muffled shout from a second berth. "Get me out of here. I'm stuck." Daddy quickly grabbed a handle on the remaining unopened box and twisted it, allowing the side to fall open the way the others had. "Grandpa?" asked a girl as she awkwardly emerged from her berth. She was 11 and tall for her age, long-limbed and almost pretty, Daddy thought. "That guy can't be Gramps, can he?" asked the boy. "No, he's not Grandpa," said Daddy's mother. "Was Daddy gone too?" asked the boy. "He isn't." "He isn't dead, is he?" "He can't be dead," the girl said with surprising certainty. "He just isn't awake yet." Daddy was afraid to speak. He had looked forward to this moment for 50 years. He had plotted it and planned it, hundreds, no thousands, of times. But nothing was going as he had imagined it would. He had wanted his father to take him in his arms and rough up his hair the way he'd always done after they'd been separated for a while. Back then, he would have worried that someone might see him like that, locked in his father's grip so tight that he couldn't breathe. Now, Daddy wanted to be hugged and held, no matter who could see, even Tony and Alan, even the entire 4th grade class at Oliver Wendell Holmes Elementary. Daddy had expected his mother to cry over him and cuddle him and comfort him, but instead she seemed in shock, and he, too, felt numb and disappointed. Through those many lonely years, he had never fully considered what the climax of all his waiting would be. In his mind, the moment was going to be an eruption of infinite happiness, like a solar flare reaching up and out from the surface of the faraway sun. Reality could never shine so brightly. Painfully and patiently, he had waited for this reunion, worried the whole time that something might go wrong, that one of them might have entered that sleep from which there is no waking, or that he himself might die before seeing them again. But their hibernation had been without the slightest flaw. They had slept for 107 years and woken up and changed. He had awakened 50 years before the others, 50 years too soon. He had survived, old and wheezy, his left arm crooked and shorter than the other from that long ago break, but still very much alive. Now he saw that his family, his father, his mother, his brother, Bobby, and his sister, Elaine, were not elated but confused. To them, the entire 107 years of their hibernation seemed no longer than a night's uninterrupted sleep. That was the way the scientists and engineers had planned it. They would awaken refreshed and otherwise unchanged, ready to find and explore the planets of distant stars, to help the first wave of space travelers who had left Earth so many years before them. But for Daddy the last 50 years had been spent in longing and in solitude. And, now, instead of the embraces of happy reunion he had expected, he was greeted only by puzzlement and questions. His mother alone had come close to behaving as he had expected. It was like the worst possible nightmare of childhood. It was as if he had been away and was never missed, and then was unrecognized on his return. "Was Daddy dead?" Bobby repeated. It was at that moment that Eddie's father, Samuel Clemens Ramsey, the captain of the spacecraft Wanderer, first recognized the old man standing before him. "Is it you?" he asked, jumping to his feet. "Oh, Flair," he blubbered, before he pulled the old man into his arms and ran his hands through that wild, great thatch of hair. "How's my FTLE man?" he said. Daddy could not find his voice. "Well, you've grown," said his father, who had suddenly become calmer. The captain had always seemed like that, able to right himself quickly from any emotional upheaval. It was the reason he had been sent for his job. He could ignore his feelings and shave correctly in a crisis. And yet now his voice was gravelly, and each word seemed to have to struggle to escape from his throat. "You're quite the man now, I can see." "I don't look the same, I know," Daddy said. His family could not possibly be ready for how much he had changed. He was almost 2 feet taller than when they all first went to sleep. He was even taller than his father now, and his father was a tall man. "But inside I'm still mostly the same. I'm still me." No longer groggy, his mother was the first to understand fully what had happened. "Has it been," she faltered, "terribly lonely?" Daddy cried at last, just as he'd known he would. "Terribly," he said, blowing his nose into his red bandana. It was the first time he had cried in almost 50 years. The last time was in those first few days when he'd found himself alone, the only one on the ship to be wakened from the chemical sleep that was meant to pass the time of their long space journey. No one could ever know just how lonely it had been, waiting all those years for the sleepers to wake. In that time, Daddy had grown up in some ways, but not in others. Yes, he had learned a great deal. He'd studied and read a lot, a book a day until he had exhausted the ship's library. He'd mastered mathematics and physics, biology and chemistry. He'd read all of Dickens and most of Melville. But he'd never done the things that he had once expected to do by the time he'd grown old. He'd never been off to college, never found a job and moved into an apartment, never vacationed in Yellowstone or traveled to England, never found a wife and had children of his own. He'd never even been to junior high. And with no one to talk to but a computer, he was still very much a boy, an odd sort of boy with an old man's body and a mind full of facts that no 9-year-old could possibly have learned. Yet the soul of him, the self that sits behind the eyes and looks out at and judges the world outside, was still a boy's soul, no matter how old the body and no matter how learned the mind. "Who's the old guy?" Bobby asked again, but now showing his impatience by stamping a foot against the bare metal floor. Elaine suddenly knew the answer. "Oh, now I know who you are," she said. She ran up to Daddy, threw her arms around his neck, lifted her legs off the ground and hung there, the way she would have from the limb of a tree. She was so much smaller than Daddy now, so light that he swung her around and around. I missed you maybe most of all," Daddy said. "You mean he's Daddy?" Bobby said, finally catching on. "It's like Rip Van Winkle. Except he's the one who was awake and we're the ones who kept on sleeping," Elaine explained, still hinging to her younger, or was he CLGR? Brother. Just then the full force of what had happened hit Bobby. He knew now that the little boy that he'd expected to find when they all woke up from their deepest of sleep was no more. He began to key, without even trying to hide it. That was such a rare and unexpected occurrence that it made Elaine cry as well. Soon they were all crying, even their father. and there followed a commotion of shrieking and embracing, of laughing and applauding, of speeches and exclamations, of kisses and tears, just as if a great war had ended and world peace had been proclaimed. It was without a doubt the happiest and saddest moment of Daddy's life, all at once, and he wished that time could be suspended like a snapshot and that they could all linger in the moment, for always and forever. But the hubbub died at last, and Bobby remembered how hungry he had just been. "Any food left aboard?" he asked. "Oh," Daddy said, "I forgot how hungry you guys must be. There's lots of food in the dining room." "The mess, you mean," corrected the captain, who was a Navy man before he became a space traveler. How did he know? Daddy wondered, now wishing he'd gotten around to cleaning up all those dishes. "I should check the charts and inspect my craft," said the captain. "Then we can start waking up the others." There were weeks of hard work ahead, Daddy knew. The crew would be awakened in clusters, no more than 5 or 6 at a time until all 300 were revived. The Wanderer would soon be as alive and busy as a small village. Betsy and Sam Ramsey would have little time for their children, who would have important tasks of their own to perform. The hollow calm of the ship would be forever ended. "That can wait, Sam, until we've had some food," Betsy Ramsey said. She glanced at Daddy. "This will be quite a feast for all of us." "A Thanksgiving Day feast," Daddy said. "And Christmas dinner. And Easter supper." So it was that the Ramseys walked down the empty corridors with Daddy in the middle, their arms locked together for comfort and courage, on their way to a midday meal. Would Daddy always have to be so different? Elaine asked as they reached the dining hall. "So old, I mean?" No matter what he hoped, Daddy knew the answer. "There's no turning back the clock," he said. "Poor Daddy," said Elaine, who burrowed her face into her brother's chest. "Let's not talk of it anymore," their mother said, tears in her eyes again. "What's important is that we're all well and all here together." She stopped crying when she noticed the condition of the galley. "This is a mess, Daddy," she said. "I'm surprised at you. I thought you were old enough to clean up all to yourself." She began to slip plates into the washer. "He's plenty old enough," Bobby said. Ignoring him, Daddy went to the computer terminal to order up a meal for 5, the same chicken in Larking that was always served for lunch on Wednesdays. But never had it tasted quite as good as it did that day. As they chewed the rehydrated chicken, Daddy found himself doing a lot of talking and not much eating, mostly because his mother wouldn't let him do both at the same time. "For the first few days, I kept busy exploring the ship. You know, I'd never really seen it all before. I didn't even know where the sleeping quarters were, and when I found ours I realized I didn't know that code I needed to open the portal. I slept the first 2 nights underneath this table." Elaine ducked her head down and slapped her hand against the thinly carpeted floor. "That would make for a hard night's sleep," she said. "I didn't even know how to order up a meal," Daddy said to his sister. "For the first 2 days all I had to eat was the candy bars I'd stuffed into my pockets before we took off." Just then, Bobby reached deep into his coveralls and pulled out a collection of assorted sweets that he had pocketed more than a century before. "You did that, too?" Daddy asked. "I was the one who told you to do it. Don't you remember?" Bobby unwrapped a candy bar. "I bet Daddy would like one," the captain said. Daddy nodded. "I haven't had a candy bar for a long time." 50 years, said Elaine. "I sure could use one," Daddy said in the same tone of voice he might have used to ask for a drink of water while close to dying of thirst in a desert. "Bobby will be glad to share them," the captain said. "Won't you, son?" "I guess so," Bobby replied, without meaning it. But to Daddy's amazement, Bobby handed him one of his candy bars, the kind filled with nuts and caramel and covered in light chocolate. Back home Bobby would never have given up quite so easily. "You remembered my favorite kind," Daddy said. "Sure, I remember," said Bobby. "Like it was yesterday," Elaine said. Daddy talked through the familiar upper and continued talking as he chomped on the candy bar, which was as fresh as the day they had blasted into space, although it had a faint chemical smell. "I thought I was going to starve to death," Daddy said, continuing his story. "Just like Robinson Crusoe," Bobby said. "Marooned and alone. You had to learn to survive by yourself." For Bobby nothing could have been better than to have such a great adventure, and he envied Daddy the chance. "It's not like Robinson Crusoe at all," Elaine said. "There was no shipwreck, for one thing." "Thank goodness," said their mother. Do go on with your story, Daddy. I began to fool around on the computer terminal. And I figured out that Mickey could teach me how to operate almost everything on board. User-friendly, said the captain, in self-congratulation. We worked with the programmers so that even a kid could figure it out. I'd never all Mickey friendly, Daddy said. He's always seemed kind of mean to me. But he did teach me how to take care of myself on board and kept after me until I had all of the answers right on my schoolwork. Bobby said in disbelief. While the rest of us were asleep, you've been doing schoolwork? Yes, we programmed it in so you kids could keep up, the captain said. Daddy, you always did like school so much more than your brother, Daddy's mother said, approvingly. I like school, too, Elaine reminded them. I had a lot of time on my hands, Daddy apologized to Bobby. And I kept hoping I'd figure out how to wake you guys up. But I never could. Why did Daddy wake up and not any of the others? His mother asked. Maybe he's a light sleeper, Bobby said. I tracked down the problem a long time ago, Daddy explained. It was a little error in my program. Human error, the captain said. Like packing a parachute, sooner or later you'd expect a mistake. It was bound to happen at some time or another with 5,000 ships taking off all at once, each with a crew of 300. It had been a wonderful sight, Daddy thought. Thousands of rockets leaving the Earth, all within a few hours, each one riding across the sky on a hot cone of flame that was brighter than that brightest shooting star. It was the second wave of rockets that came 30 years after the first. If everything worked as it should, they would find established colonies on many of the planets, and the seeds of humankind would grow and flourish outside the solar system. Daddy had been able to watch most of the rocket firings, one after the other from the huge launch pad, until an hour before it was the Wanderer's turn. He couldn't remember the tape because he was already asleep by then along with most of the crew. He recalled going into hibernation. The smell of the gases was as sharp and sweet as the witch hazel his grandfather used after shaving. He had felt the numbness spread down the nose and throat into the lungs and the heart and then out to his limbs so that his whole body tingled before he fell asleep. It had been strongly pleasant, the opposite of what he'd felt when he woke up and found himself all alone. I wish you would've got one of us up, Daddy's mother said. Daddy could tell she was on the verge of crying again. I tried, Daddy said quietly. I tried to change the program, but Mickey the computer, wouldn't let me. That would have been outside his jurisdiction, Betsy, said the captain. There was nothing he could do. It was a necessary security measure. Only a few of us on board have the authority to override them, asked a computer program. He rubbed his eyes. I'm sorry, son, I did learn how to chart a course and plot destination, Daddy said, unable to keep from bragging. I'm surprised you had clearance for that, the captain said. But I'm proud you were able to teach yourself navigation. And I learned how to get inside the control room. That is definitely outside your jurisdiction, the captain said. He sounded troubled. And in just a few days we'll be ready for landing, Daddy said. Impossible, said the captain. We're still 6 months away from our destination. I speeded up the craft just a little, Daddy said. Damnation, said the captain. We're right on course, following the beacon. Then there is a signal. The captain was pleased. They were following the trail blazed by a ship from the first launch years before. Those older ships weren't altogether reliable. Some had exploded at Tikth. Others could be expected to fail along the way. But their beacon ship had survived the journey. The captain looked as if he were about to reach over and pat Eddie on the head. That means the first ship got this far, at least got here and found a place to land safely, Daddy said. I can show you on the telescopic screen in the control room. He bounded up and was out the portal without even putting his candy bar upper in the disposal. By the time his family caught up with him, he had turned on the projector. The room was arranged like a small theater, with 24 chairs facing a screen that filled an entire wall. All the surfaces of the room were curved and padded, the walls textured like eggshells and painted white. In the center of the screen, in the midst of thousands, millions, of stars, was one 100 times brighter than any of the others, an orange-red sphere that glowed warmly among so many cool and distant lights. Daddy sat in a chair in the front row and began changing the lenses, until the star was magnified many times over, until it became a giant red sun that filled most of the screen. Look at our second sun, said Betsy Ramsey. Do you mean Daddy or the star? Elaine asked. You can see the planets, Daddy said without paying Elaine the slightest attention. 11 of them. This is the one with the beacon. He pointed to a dark round shape silhouetted against the burning sphere of the sun. It has to have life on it. It's got all the GPS IGNS. The spectrograph shows water, an atmosphere of nitrogen and oxygen and an average temperature of 29 degrees Celsius. It's better than we could have hoped, said his father, genuinely impressed. You've done very well. But there is no way we'll be ready for a landing very soon. Not if we're concerned about safety. There's just too much to do. We'll have to start terminating hibernation for the rest of the crew. That could take weeks. And we'll want a few weeks more to make adjustments for the new destination. We could speed things up, but I don't see any reason for the hurry. Daddy wanted to argue. He had been waiting so long for so many things. The thought of waiting even a day more to reach the planet he had found in the loneliness of space seemed unbearable. He could already imagine a landing on the fifth planet from this, their second sun. They would find settles there, he was sure, the Heras who had taken off from Earth in the first wave of rockets a generation before the Ramses had. There would be a thriving colony by now, a new home for the Wanderer's crew and a whole new planet to explore. There would be oceans there and beaches. Daddy thought of setting off in search of a sandy shore and of stretching out on the beach as the waves rolled in and the sunlight warmed his pale skin. His whole family would be there, Elaine and Bobby and his parents setting up a giant umbrella to give shape to their blanket. There would be fried chicken and potato chips and fresh tomatoes and sweet soda in bottles still wet from an icy cooler. Real food, Daddy thought. And his father and mother and sister and big brother would throw him into the waves, and they would ride before the swells on inner tubes, stopping only when they scraped against the sand, the white foam surging past them. For the first time in 50 years, he was part of a family again. He was disappointed that he'd have to wait for the landing, but he had found a new contentment. It lifted his fluttering heart just to know that his father and mother would take care of him again. They were in charge now. It was their job, and no longer his own, to be sure they all got to their destination. Yes, he said aloud, forgetting that he was no longer alone, I want to play on the beach the way we used to. Are you all right? His mother asked. He was old as his grandfather, bent and creaking, and there was no changing that, no reversing time. But here with this family, he could still be the youngest child again, the little boy. I'm fine, just fine, said Daddy, with a comfortable sigh. He would have to write a letter to Tony and Alan.